Video games are fun. They can be terrifying, adrenaline pumping, or sometimes even sad, but they're always fun. Sure, there are those games that some would argue fail to meet this single criterion, like the dreaded E.T. game for the Atari. I'll admit that while that game was a sideshow, utterly confusing, insanely crafted in its redundant gameplay, and a piece of total crap, but the idea is fun. Hell, it's even fun to talk about how bad the game is in comparison to most others. But the truth is, there is one game that even the thought of sends a shiver down my spine. It's all my fault. This all started when I took that job for the National Forestry Department. My position title was literally general laborer. But hell, it was the perfect summer gig for a young guy like me. No, I'm not still in high school. I'm not quite that young. But times have been hard, and long story short, I needed work. Now, the title of general laborer, of course, carries with it a wide variety of job tasks and responsibilities, doing anything from helping to mark trails, clean national park grounds, to even helping file paperwork at some of the stations, depending on what area you were assigned. My job? Demolition. Now, I don't know about you guys, whether you would enjoy such an activity or loathe it, but personally, I found myself somewhere in the middle. I guess the smashing stuff with large hammers part is pretty cool, but having to lug all the resulting debris from the inside of this remote cabin to a quad tow-behind trailer bed outside was a tad arduous, especially in the thick summer heat. But when it all boiled down, the pay was pretty good, so I stayed on, enthusiastically. My boss was cool enough to leave me to it for mostly the whole day, allowing me the pleasure of working by myself in the middle of this woodland paradise. Now, I'll admit it, I don't get all stupid stoned or anything like that, but if presented with the opportunity and a job lacking in deep complexity, I'll have a small toke here and there throughout the workday. I suppose on that day, it had been about an hour or so since I had seen my boss from the cabin's path-like drive and down the forest trail, leaving me both the quad and the tow behind. Ensured now that he would be gone for at least some time, I laid my 2-pound sledge beside my feet and squatted down at the wall adjacent to me until sitting, leaning against it. Before I lit the joint that I pulled from my top left shirt pocket, I lifted my hand to raise the window behind me, allowing fresh air to enter and the smell of marijuana smoke to escape, just in case. Taking a few tokes, I broke into a hacking fit, leaning over to cough up a lung, and between my gasps for air and wincing of my eyes, I caught sight of something flat, gray, and rigid beyond a hole in the base of the wall across from me. I could only see about a fourth of it, but due to its distinguished, iconic shape, I already knew exactly what it was. Excited to find out the type and form, I regained my composure, gathering back oxygen and, now thoroughly high as fuck, I eagerly approached the object, tore the hole in the sheetrock just a little more, and pulled it free with my hand. I was right. This thing was certainly a classic Nintendo game, rectangular with ridges running the length of the mid-right-hand side, and the box-shaped depression at the top for grip that notified me as to what it was, solidified my assumptions. But my curiosity expounded tenfold when my investigative progression reached a sudden dead end. I wouldn't know exactly which game this was until I could get it home and plug it into my NES, because it completely lacked a label. No picture, no Sharpie label left behind by the original owner, nothing. I would have to wait for the workday to be over. You gotta understand something here. Before I get into the consequences of my actions, because it may help you to understand them, my actions that is, I am a huge Friday the 13th fan. Like, seriously. Think of the biggest Friday the 13th super fan that you know, and I'm probably more of a fan than that guy or girl. Like, my obsession with these movies might just rival that of Kane Hodder's, i.e., Jason's, for that matter. As a kid, I lived in both perpetual fear and awe of these movies. The love for horror that has come cascading afterward has spawned from this legendary franchise. In a very literal way, it has helped to shape me into who I am. So, maybe you can actually imagine the thrill when I saw that iconic mask in all its 8-bit glory, before being stabbed through the eye hole by a dagger, flashing and displaying the Friday the 13th logo, accompanied by an NES tone replication of the ch-ch-ch-ah-ah-ah sound so closely associated with the saga. I couldn't believe it. I love this game. Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to the point of being seemingly impossible to beat, but on the contrary, it's actually as equally as easy as people consider it challenging. Once you realize the mechanics of lighting all 6 fireplaces with all 6 counselors to achieve formidable weapon unlocks and the ever-useful flashlight, the game is simply a matter of time, because after you obtain a strong weapon by every counselor, you essentially take on the role of organizing a teenage task force whose sole mission is to track down a bizarre purple version of Cunningham's brainchild and destroy him. Sure, Jason can take away health in this game very quickly, but with the right weapon and strategy, you can deplete his even faster. In all honesty, I'm surprised the game worked at all, considering where I found it. And the thing even booted up on its first try. No taking it back out and blowing on it again or anything. But when I pressed the start button, I at first thought the game was glitched, because each of the characters, George, Paul, Mark, Laura, Debbie, and Christy, were missing their names. Not only that, but the world map was different as well. I don't know how many of you guys have played Super Mario World, never mind how many of you have reached the special world beyond Star Road and then beat it, but when you do, the Mario World overmap will have its color palette altered to reflect fall instead of spring. Greens become bright oranges and stuff like that. The sickly orange color of the Camp Crystal Lake overworld map appeared to be very similar to that, as if to represent the colors of sunset. But beyond those two things, everything looked okay. I was going to take the game out of the system and perform the ritual of blowing air on the cartridge before placing it into the system, readjusting it a few dozen times before finally getting it to work properly. But I noticed something before I did, stopping my finger a few inches away from the power button. In the place where George's name should have been was a white, blinking underscore icon, as if begging me to manually enter a name. For those of you who have never played this game, this is not a normal function of it. So, I figured what the hell, and pushed the A button, typically the action button, only half expecting a reaction. I was a little more than half surprised when a scroll-down keyboard window appeared, allowing me to enter up to 7 characters for each name of my choosing. Using the mental prototypes available to me, I decided to name each counselor after an individual I know in real life. For George, a sluggish, slow-moving character, I chose the name Terry after my best friend. He's probably the most chill person I know, and his demeanor led me to this correlation. For Paul, the token black guy, I chose the name Eric after another friend of mine and one of the coolest black guys I've ever met. For Mark, the fast-moving, high-jumping athlete, I chose my own name, Trevor. Not that I'm a fast-moving, high-jumping athletic guy, but who doesn't want to play their video games as the strongest character if available? For the 3 girls, I began with Laura, a red-headed counselor with relatively good movement abilities. For her, I chose the name Monica, for one of the feistiest gingers I know. She too sometimes works in the same preserve as I do, and for a tiny thing, she's incredibly resilient and efficient. For Christy, the female Mark, I chose the name of my girlfriend, Alice, for obvious reasons. And finally, for the slow-moving Debbie counselor, I chose the name Helga. Now, technically, I don't know a Helga, but the fat girl who works at the gas station down the street is plenty slow-moving enough, and typically ill-tempered, earning her the name Hellmart Helga. Trust me, she achieved this nickname through incredible diligence in being rude to customers, unhygienic, and completely unprofessional. And now that all 6 counselors had a corresponding name, I pressed the start button, initiating a sequence of events that would change my life forever. The first thing I noticed is that the game began at sunset, rather than the typical daytime. When I pressed the start button again and brought up the map view of the lake, I considered that maybe this was why the world map of the lake was the color that it was, and tinted its yellowish orange. I was now very excited to play this game. Before I was brought to the game itself, the typical dialogue of telling me my objectives, such as lighting the fireplaces in each of the large cabins, played out as usual. But given the skewed presentation of the game, deviating so blatantly from the licensed NES version, that I knew I was in for some unexpected surprises, revolving around my favorite horror franchise. There was no way I wasn't going to play this game. At least, that's how I felt at first. Now, I do know of a way to glitch the game and gather the torch, one of the most effective weapons against Jason, without having to light all the fireplaces with each counselor, but I wanted to invest the time into this game, so I decided to play through this version the way the original was meant to be played, even though I was curious as to whether or not the glitch would work. Pressing the start button one last time, the alarm-like beeping sound indicated either the 15 children or one of the camp counselors were under attack from Jason, giving me a whopping 60 seconds to get to the scene, 30 before a counselor starts losing life or the 15 children start getting picked off one by one at a rate of about every 5 seconds thereafter. Pausing once again, I found Jason to be attacking the 15 children at the lake. Seeing as I began the game with slow-moving Helga on the opposite end of the map near the caves, I found the nearest small cabin and transferred control to a counselor closer to the site of distress. Unfortunately, the closest person to the children was Terry, the George character. Opting for a stronger yet further away counselor, I chose Monica. Sure, the Laura character couldn't jump high, but she could move fast. She was positioned in a small cabin near the northern woods, not far from the path leading to Crystal Lake, so I was pretty confident I'd make it in time. With a few seconds to spare even. But I fucked up. For those of you who have never played Friday the 13th for the NES, just understand that navigation is a little awkward, as it is a side-scroller with up and down mechanics for traveling different paths, basically consisting of 3 circles. The inner small circle surrounds the cave area, while the larger inner circle wraps around the circumference of the lake. These are of course surrounded by a master circle path that surrounds the entire area. Adding a few woodland areas with no map available, and having to judge your direction by accounting for your backdrop, you can get turned around pretty easily, going in the wrong direction. Well, basically, I should have turned left at the cabin door, but instead I turned right. By the time I had realized that I was headed in the wrong direction, I had managed to waste an additional 8 seconds. Even if I were to switch counselors again, Terry was the only one closer and surely wouldn't make it any faster than Monica, so I altered my heading accordingly and made my way to the lakeshore as fast as I could. I fought hordes of zombies, attained a lighter, a dagger, and a key, and other than the sunset backdrop, everything played out as normal. But when I reached the lake and went into the boat, the first signs of something being wrong presented itself. The lake water was red. It doesn't matter the time of day. Crystal Lake is always blue in the licensed version we all know. This just solidified my assumption that I was indeed playing some hacked version of this game, somehow ported into a workable cartridge. The cabins on the lake shore just came into view when a sudden loud sound startled me just before Jason made his first appearance, confronting me half submerged in the lake and completely unavoidable by the water, causing significant damage to Monica. It happened in only a fraction of a second, but even in that small amount of time, I could tell that there was something seriously wrong with the Jason character, like almost glitched in a way. He was still wearing that iconic, ridiculously purple jumpsuit, but the mask was slightly altered in a way that I couldn't really identify yet, partially due to the speed at which he flew past the bottom of the screen. At about 3/4 health, I made it to the dock and pressed up on the directional pad. I honestly was at a complete loss of words, and my confusion caused my logic and train of thought to leave me, rendering me literally stunned. The cabin music seemed slower, and a little more deeper in pitch, and the surrounding walls of the cabin were not their signature clean, monotone slatted boards, but now depicted as rotten, dilapidated, and scrawled in graffiti. But what threw my mind into disequilibrium was the row of children seated across the back wall. A full cabin presents 5 children at a time, as there are 3 cabins on the lake comprising the 15 children, and when one dies, there will be one less in the row, simply gone. Before me were seated 4 children campers, and on the end, a gruesome scene of marred red and black pixels decorated with bits of white and tan. Once I regained my cognitive balance, my thoughts wrestled with the idea of the image to be a representation of a camper chopped into dog food-sized bits, or simply squashed like a bug. But I tried to convince myself that maybe this was just some sort of glitch due to the extra features of the game. Maybe whoever created this thing tried to insert an element too complex for the NES to display, but even as I tried to abandon the idea altogether and search the cabin for Jason, I really even knew then that the latter was not true. Reaching the back room and turning to view the left wall, I was confronted with another loud Friday the 13th style jump scare sound effect as my first battle with the infamous killer of Crystal Lake began. I dodged every attack, and each dagger hit its mark. The first day, Jason is pretty slow, and his attacks are pretty simple to avoid. Even the twisted look of the hockey mask wasn't enough to distract me, and 7 blows were delivered with ease. As Jason faded away, and the dialogue of "You have defeated Jason, ... for now," scrolled across the screen, only one thought continuously echoed through my mind. What the fuck was that? Jason's mask was all wrong. The eye holes all messed up, bigger and kind of smeared, and well, the mouth portion was all fucked up too. But with the 8-bit graphics, I couldn't really make out the details. I turned around, refused to look back at the wall with the bug-squashed child, and left the cabin. Now I knew that not only was this game altered in unexpected ways, but therefore also meant that I could expect just about anything to happen as I played, because when I left the front door, I was not greeted by the blood-red waters of Crystal Lake against a sunset backdrop, but rather an 8-bit depiction of a suburban-style street beneath what turned into a night sky, complete with house, pavement, road lines, and street sign. Not all that unlike the Nightmare on Elm Street game for the same system. I at first scratched my head, deciding to continue on at this point and proceed right. As I did, I noticed something else. Not only was my character moving slower, I was no longer playing as the Monica character. I was now playing as Helga, Slow Debbie. And then the strangest thing happened. Jason just jumped out of the screen like he usually does when you're walking around the camp randomly, but he attacked the character once and just took off before I even had a chance to throw anything. Confused, but not too befuddled due to the context of what I was playing, I decided to continue on. 2 houses down, I stopped my character cold and stared intently at the house in the backdrop. It couldn't be. Where I live is pretty distinctive, with a birdhouse mailbox, a dual walkway that wraps into itself like a figure 8, and a motion light attached to the siding beside the master bedroom window, and a small stained glass window on the front door. I tried my hardest to rationalize it away, but there was no denying the truth. This pixelated image boasted each of the same elements, and many more identifying objects. To make matters worse, as soon as the house had come into view, my motion light outside, in reality, kicked on as well. I debated with myself for a moment, and decided that whether or not I was just being silly, and that this game could at the very least wait until the next day. And besides, I wanted to check out why the light outside now lit up the front lawn beyond the living room glass aperture. I stood to my feet, turned off the system, and proceeded to the door. I found 2 things that night. One curious, small, and placed into my pocket. The other unnerving, disequalizing, and full of unknown insinuation. I didn't know what happened or why, but I figured at the time it to be best to just simply go on as if nothing happened. But the next morning, when I walked out my front door to be greeted by a dim morning sky, the contrasting flashing lights from the drive of the house 3 doors down instantly caught my attention. I wouldn't find out what exactly happened until later that day, and even when I did, I still wasn't convinced that the key I found on the front step, or the large, muddy footprints that dotted my walkways, had anything to do with that child's murder. But when I heard how it happened, the brutality involved, I got a sick feeling in my stomach that grew exponentially larger. I was dreading what I would later discover to be the truth. You see, the family living 3 houses down has, or had, 1 child, a young boy named Christopher. Christopher's dad even breaks for fucking squirrels. Well, the cops showed up that morning after being called to the home by Mr. and Mrs. Jameson themselves, because they apparently found their boy dead in his room. But not just dead. Dismembered. I guess he had been so badly ripped and hacked apart that there wasn't much left to put in a body bag. This actually made sense, as earlier that morning, I saw a large plastic box, similar to a tote, being wheeled out of the home. Clear plastic with something black inside. It was a body bag, and they had to secure it with a plastic container because the small bits in the body bag would have caused the thing to take on the shape, texture, and complicated nature of a 6-foot, half-inflated water balloon. That if spilled and broke, would have exploded what was left of that little boy all over the sidewalk. The fucked up thing was, the thing that caused the police to consider the parents as the main suspects, something I knew to be untrue even then, was that each and every door to the house was locked from the inside. I would have never picked that thing up again had I taken it seriously. But how could I possibly been expected to abide by the demands of a simple NES game? Sure, it seemed coincidental, the manner in which that boy had been murdered, his killer still on the loose, the key I had found the night previous, and a few other relatable but small instances I'll soon describe. But given a large enough passage of time, these conjectures are easily swept off by disregard, and without the insights I now have, the amount of time needed was both small and negligible. Sure, when I left for work that morning, I scanned over the scene of police cars and officers interrogating bystanders. In fact, even after I had left the commotion behind, I placed a call through my Bluetooth to one of my neighbors, inquiring into what exactly was going on. Shocked to hear of the homicide only a few doors down from me, my mind was both distracted by my commute and any correlations I have made then. There's a not-so-subtle predictability to routine behavior. I stop into the same general store every single day before work and grab the same things, and on this day, like many others before, I didn't even remember the drive to the small gas station parking lot. A mind full of the morning's events, I paid Helga and her negative disposition no mind at all, headed to the cooler to grab a monster for the day. Grabbing a tall green label, I turned back towards the counter to make my purchase. Sure enough, there was Hellmart Helga doing her best to ignore her customers and stare at her phone, heavily engaged in some text-based conversation. I placed the can on the counter, pulled out my wallet to retrieve some dollars, and awaited Helga, or whatever her real name is, to acknowledge my existence. After a substantial silence, and wait for no apparent reason, I blurted out, "Hey, I gotta get to work. Do you think you can ring me up here?" She proceeded to slam the phone upon the counter adjacent the register and sternly inform me that she was having an important conversation, holding up her arm and stating, "I was attacked last night, douchebag." Okay, so maybe I had been a little unobservant in not noticing the heavy bandage on Helga's right arm. But even if I had, why would I assume that either she was attacked or that she was in an intense conversation about it? I did ask if she knew the guy, or if she got a good look at him, but her response made no logical sense, leading me to conclude that she was just being a bitch and refusing to tell me what happened. There's no way I was going to believe that some weirdo just jumped out of the shadows while she was walking home, stabbed her in the arm, and just ran away, without asking for her purse or anything. And when she followed it up by explaining to me that the guy simply disappeared into thin air afterward, I knew she was pulling my chain. Slightly disgruntled by the falsity, but choosing to remain quiet and just pay for the monster so I could leave, I paid the amount due and proceeded back to my vehicle. And as I drove towards the woodland, I still hadn't made the connection, the linkage, between the child homicide, Helga's wound, and the previous night's events. Pulling into the driveway, I noted 3 vehicles, one more than the usual 2. The SUV belonged to my boss, and the Jeep belonged to Caleb, another groundskeeper, helping to fix up the grounds for the same meager pay. The short bed pickup, however, belonged to Monica, the feisty, mostly bitchy redhead that I'm sometimes forced to work with. Upon receiving my orders for the day, I continued demolition on that forested cabin. I was relieved to hear Monica assigned to work with Caleb, scouring the park for litter and refuse. I honestly couldn't help but chuckle a bit to myself, remembering her character in the game the night before, taking damage just like Helga, and how ironic it was. My chuckling stopped, and I think I was holding my breath. Monica was sporting a bandage as well, on her right hand. I'm pretty sure she was scowling at my presence as I approached her, but I paid it no mind. I felt an irresistible urge to ask, "How'd you hurt your hand?" "None of your fucking business," she yelled back at me. But I persisted, insisting she explain. Maybe she's not as tough as she makes herself out to be. Maybe she sensed the urgency in my tones, but she finally relinquished to me the details of her wound, the blur that had pushed her over and ran away before disappearing into thin air, leaving her with a gash on her hand that she didn't know was there until she noticed the blood running thick down her wrist and forearm. I had nothing to say back. My words were caught up with suspicions, rationale, and a welling unknown sensation that I would later define as guilt. But those thoughts were impossible, and yet lingered all the same. This day was warmer than the last, and sweat beaded on my brow like the condensation of a lemonade glass left out in the sun. The forest was peaceful, and I was mostly left to my own devices, and had my phone to play music and text my girlfriend to keep me company. The events were so coincidental, I just had to mention it to her. At the very least, she could share in the irony, which I was adamant of convincing myself that it's all it was. She admittedly found the entire scenario oddly coincidental as well, but like me, had no choice but to slough it off with rationale. My phone had helped keep me distracted enough throughout the day, no doubt slowing down my progress in demolishing the interior of that old cabin for renovation, but I put in a good day's work nonetheless, finishing my day and placing a few savable items by the workshed door out back. Hoss, my superior, would have allowed me to simply place the items inside, a still viable table and a small wooden chair today, but claimed fear of theft. Not by me, of course, and instructed me to just leave the items outside the door. He would put them inside at the end of the day, after I had left. But on this day, setting down the bulky end table next to the uncomfortable-looking wooden chair, I caught notice of something in my peripheral vision. I had gotten a good enough look at it to gain a pretty accurate description, but when my head turned to catch a direct glance, there was nothing there, as if nothing was ever there. But what I saw was so distinguished. I had even taken in some detail. A humanoid standing just beyond the low-hanging limbs and thick brush at the edge of the tree line, only a few yards away. Tall, dark blue or maybe black, standing utterly motionless, and its face, it was as if it too were concealed in part by the flora, but it wasn't at all, just distorted and somehow blurred, almost wrinkled. But it wasn't the wrinkles of age. It was as if its entire face was adorned with creases and folds that ran the diameter of its dimensions. And I'm pretty sure it was bald, but I can't really say for sure, because the thing was simply gone in an instant. This too could have easily been explained away as a trick of the mind, but for some reason, it sat with me longer, lingering about my thoughts, affecting my conscious mind more so than Monica's and Helga's inexplicable wounds and accompanying stories of how they acquired them, more so than the child murdered behind locked doors by gentle and loving parents, a few doors down from where I live. I tried to shake it, get the idea out of my mind, but that figure haunted my waking thoughts and nightmares for days, weeks, and all that time, I wouldn't allow myself to even think about playing that terrible game, half out of disinterest, half from trying to deny those terrible implications it brought with it. It was weeks before I had even turned on my old NES again. I think it was a late-night discussion with my friend Eric on an internet forum, debating the superiority of the NES over the Sega Master System, when that old sense of nostalgia was induced. Even when, as I inserted Super Mario Bros. 3 and turned the system on, I felt apprehensive. But Mario collected coins and power-ups without issue. The glitchy game I had experienced nearly a month prior to this was clearly not a result of faulty hardware. Now, maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was denial, but I somehow convinced myself that no harm could have been caused by once again playing that unmarked NES cartridge. Before you shake your heads at my stupidity, you have to understand that almost a whole month had gone by without incident. This was just one weird day we're talking about, and eventually, coincidence turns into conjecture, and from there, superstition. I am not superstitious, but what I am is a Friday the 13th fan. In a way, I didn't really have a choice. Now, just because I had foregone the implications doesn't mean to say I forgot them entirely. I remembered the night I first played that game, the weird functions it performed, such as the ability to name characters or the swapping between forested and suburban backdrops, but the majority of the game played out as normal. Well, up until the end of the first night anyway, when I decided to give it a rest and turn the system off. But I say mostly, because there was one more than odd instance that did occur, and would become more relevant than I could have known from the start. Opening the character screen displayed no altered visuals, no places or ability to enter names of Eric, Terry, Alice, Monica, Helga, or myself. I wanted to choose the strongest character to start, so I picked Mark. Like I said earlier, it mostly progressed as normal, collecting lighters and keys, lighting fireplaces, and getting the flashlight. I remember specifically obtaining a machete and handing it off to Chrissy, as my character was low on health, and she was up to head into the woods and receive the note that would award her the torch, a very powerful weapon to use against Jason. Sure, the alarm for the random counselor or child in harm's way would sound, but with a little strategic thinking and quick reflexes, damage was mostly avoided and every character in the game was intact. Armed with a machete, a key, and 3 medicine jars, I proceeded down the lakeside path and into the woods. Now, as usual, I went right, then up at the first path, and then up again, leading me to a hidden cabin door in the woods requiring a key. Since I had one, I pressed up on the directional pad and proceeded right through. And this is where things went strange. Instead of the interior of a cabin, like I was supposed to see once passing through the door, I was instead presented with yet another dirt path leading upwards into a forest backdrop, only this time, no path leading left or right. I'd never seen anything like this, and I'm pretty sure there is no such setup like this in the game at all. Figuring the game simply glitched when I went through the door, putting me back in some rendering of a path outside. I pressed up, and sure enough, was led right back to the same hidden cabin door in the woods, or one that looked just like it. Walking up to it, I entered through the door again, and this time, it took, and I entered what was once a normal-looking interior, but now run down, decrepit, and more resembling a slaughterhouse with wood floors and walls. At first, I had trouble distinguishing whether or not everything wasn't meant to be depicted as bloody and spattered, or if the color theme was simply crimson. But the appearance of 8-bit skulls and miscellaneous body parts littering the cabin floor solidified the former. Befuddled and somewhat disappointed in that the game had played normally up to this point, I pressed left on the directional pad halfway through my turn to leave, and noticed a series of things in succession, just before my player's life ended instantaneously. First to catch my focus was the lack of anything but a wall. The forest cabins have enough space to progress left and proceed into the next room. This cabin was apparently nothing more than a windowless box with a door. The next I noticed was a second life bar with the name Jason displayed below it. This means that Jason is somewhere in the cabin with me, which is a typical mechanic of the game. Bracing myself for an imminent battle in this cramped space, I finally took notice of the small white note on the floor. Selecting the Take option, a message scrolled across the screen at the bottom. Truth will damage Jason the most. Usually this message reads, Fire will damage Jason the most. But before I had any real time to contemplate this discrepancy further, that damn jump scare effect nearly jolted me out of my seat as Jason ran by the screen from left to right, like he does when he's swimming in the lake. And to make the imagery even more unusual, Chrissy died from only one hit from her attacker, and I was brought back to the character selection screen. Now, I was torn here between turning this damn thing off in dismay and confusion, or reveling in such a new experience to one of my most favorite classic games. So, about half of me was eager when I selected George and continued my playthrough, now only having 5 characters left, and each of them pretty well armed. I was poised to tackle the killer of Crystal Lake, provided the game played fair. And sure enough, it did just that, allowing me to conclude day 1 without any more surprises. One part relieved and one part disappointed, I looked over at the clock, realized the time and that I had to work the following day, and decided to turn off the NES and head to bed. That night, I had strange dreams. Dreams of the woods, that old national forest. At least, I assumed it was those woods. Some landmarks and objects, such as signs or structures, seemed vaguely familiar, but somehow, for some reason, my vision was blurred, as if seeing through foggy window glass that's nearly opaque with filth. Objects were more of blurry colors and less of detail, but for some reason, I had a gnawing feeling that someone was there as I wandered, that someone was watching me the whole time, and that they wanted to do me harm. Reaching my hands up to touch my face, to discover what was obscuring my vision, I felt the strong grip of 2 hands around my neck simultaneously and originating from behind me. And then I woke up. I didn't go into work that day, as it turns out, but not because of fitful sleep or determination driven by confusion, but because I was called into the police station for questioning as I was dressing for work. Picking up the phone, I was at first confused to be introduced to a high-ranking police detective, but the feeling that came next was indescribable. Disjointed from the world. Spiritually discombobulated, maybe, but joined with a disbelief holding back insurmountable grief, a feeling that would give way to oppressing guilt. Alice, my girlfriend, was dead. She'd been found in her apartment by her roommate after returning home from a late-night shift. Alice was discovered brutally mutilated, her fingernails somehow worn down to the bone, and her head severed from the bottom jaw up, leaving her mostly decapitated. Now, when I was younger, I had gotten arrested for receipt of stolen property. Nothing major. The seat covers out of someone else's car, but it still resulted in my prints ending up in the system. But still, the miracle was that a match from the prints on the murder weapon, a bloodied, rusty machete found at the scene, was found nearly instantly, in a matter of a couple of hours, and sure enough, they matched mine. But that was impossible. I hadn't seen Alice in days, and I don't think I've ever even owned a machete. But even as the cops questioned me, and I pleaded ignorance, my mind couldn't help but return to the events of the game the night before. How it was Chrissy who died instantaneously, holding a weapon that Mark had given her shortly before. A machete. How on the first night I was able to name the characters after people I know or knew, naming Mark after myself, and Chrissy after Alice, my girlfriend. Coincidence is one thing, but this was much more than that. But I told the detective none of this. This, or the other thing. The other thing that's been keeping me up at night, causing me endless waves of waking fatigue. Every time I look in the mirror at this point, I could see him there, out of the corner of my eye, exactly as the others described him. But every time I would turn my head, or even my eyes, just to bring the thing into my direct line of sight, it simply vanished, as if it wasn't there at all. I felt his presence everywhere I went, even though I could never see it. But I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew I didn't murder my girlfriend. And I knew, even then, what he wanted from me. But the last thing I ever wanted to do is play that fucking game ever again. The police had me right where they wanted me at this point, and I saw no conceivable way out. There was no way they were going to believe the truth. A truth that I could barely believe myself. A video game that somehow augments reality. A psychotic killer leaping between fiction and reality, leaving corpses in his wake, and a blood trail leading straight to me, including my fingerprints being found upon the murder weapon. With the homicide of that small child so near to where I reside, it didn't exactly take a top-notch detective to put two and two together that I was somehow linked to both murders, inexplicably to one at least. However, since I frequented my girlfriend's apartment often, I argued that I had some hiking gear left at her place, up to and including a machete that was found at the scene. That combined with the actual hiking gear that I did leave there, being an oversized backpack and a pair of boots, the story checked out, and without something more substantial, they had to let me go. They even noted that not a single print had been made in blood, underlying that it was possible that I may not be the culprit. I was released and sent on my way after many hours of interrogation. The detectives telling me not to leave town until they could get everything sorted out, meaning until they could prove my innocence. I probably should have run, but it likely wouldn't have done any good, even if I did try. Get as far away as four wheels could take me, and somehow not look guilty as hell doing so. I knew that it would follow me anyways, always appearing just out of my direct line of sight, making it impossible to gain a detailed sight of it, and I knew it wouldn't leave me alone until I played that damn game again. That unlabeled NES cartridge that turned out to be some twisted hack or otherwise version of Friday the 13th for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. But it wasn't fear of that thing that forced me into playing again, or the sleepless nights for that matter, or even the guilt over what had occurred, but the realization that if I were ever to get any answers, I would find them in there. I would like to state, with all certainty, that it was a supernatural force that took control over my body and forced me to reset up the system and return to what I even considered to be a very bad idea. In all actuality, it more or less felt as though my actions were, at least in part, not under my own control. But there was also a definite sense of autonomy. And again, although just out of my direct line of sight, I knew it was there, watching over me, making sure I was doing what it desired of me. That much was clearly understood, but the why of it all, still far from my grasp, leaving me in the dark among some of the worst set of circumstances imaginable. Completely disarmed of logic and rationale, I began another session of Friday the 13th for the NES, completely vulnerable to this game's intents. With the light now on, and the game display before me, I pressed start once again, taking special note of my now racing heart. As with some previous experiences, this game seemed to retain some of my earlier progress, even without a save feature, underscored by the missing character on the initial selection screen, Chrissy. Just seeing that blank space on the display before me was a concrete reminder that Alice, my girlfriend, was truly gone. And for the next few moments, all I could muster was to weep uncontrollably. Thanking Christ that there was no one around to watch me blubber like a little girl, I eventually regained my composure and used that pain as motivation for uncovering the truth of what exactly happened to her. Swallowing my guilt and hating this game for seemingly mocking me with that black rectangle, I selected Mark and began the game. This time, things didn't progress into the weird and strange, slowly and methodically, and rather imposed its queer nature just after pressing the start button. Both the music and the scrolling text both indicated that it was the end of a day, and presumably the first day. The text read, "You still haven't defeated Jason, and now he's even stronger." This cryptic phrase sent a sensation of ice up my spine, and contemplating the presence I could now sense, looming and oppressive, I trembled for a moment or two out of sheer fear of the unknown, as if, instead of staring into this television screen, I was rather looking down into a chasm as black abyss, what lay in wait inside the inky void, unknown, and completely left to the conceivable horrors of one's imagination. At this point, I can't honestly tell you what drove me on, what pushed me through such strong fear, but I suppose the desire for knowing the truth is a difficult animal to subdue. The game immediately opened to a night sky and placed Mark, my character, outside, near to the woods on the outer ring, away from the lake on the north edge of the map. As I moved my character forward, I noticed something. That looming presence I could feel staring knives into my back. It was gone. Or at least, I'm pretty sure that if it were there at all, it was gone now. I decided to jump around, hopping over zombies, in hopes of gathering useful items such as medicine jars or weapon upgrades. Maybe a minute later, my eagerness was rewarded with the appearance of a pixelated axe. Of course, this would have been odd had I been playing an official copy, as the axe never appears in this way under normal circumstances. But this was no normal, official game. Maybe 3 seconds after I had cleaved my first zombie with a flying axe to the face, the death alarm began to sound, loudly, and a sensation of dread, stronger than anything I had ever felt before in my life, enveloped me like an iron blanket, crushing me with its weight. I knew, before I had even looked, that whoever was in danger, that if I didn't get there in time, they were going to die, and I would indirectly be responsible for another mysterious, gruesome, and violent death of an otherwise innocent person. Glancing up at the top of the screen, I saw it was the counselor icon bar flashing. Pressing pause, I not only searched for the individual under attack, I also strategized my approach to the nearest small cabin. Now, when a counselor is being attacked by Jason, the cabin selected by the player will flash, and the cabin under siege by the hockey-masked wearing fiend will flash green, but a shade surprisingly close to the brown of the cabins. Effectively, the only way to discern which cabin Jason is in is to cycle through until only one cabin is flashing, indicating that the cabin selected and the cabin being plundered are the one and the same. A few moments later, I found it was Laura, or Monica's cabin, in which Jason pursued his next victim. I will admit, there was a fleeting moment of relief when I realized that it was a person I wasn't known for being too close to, but still, the thought of being responsible for her death appalled me, and the sensation passed by faster than the instant in which it arrived. The next thing I noticed is that I was still a good walk away from any cabin, large or small, being at the top of the map, near the woods. So, getting to Monica, or switching to her character, before the 30-second damage function would kick in, would demand a daunting mad rush to the nearest small cabin, risking damage to my own character. I threw my head backward in disgust, fearing the insinuations of the forthcoming next minute or two. But as I leaned my head back forward to center on the screen, my sigh of frustration turned into a lack of breath at paralyzing realization. Small, and in the left-hand corner of the screen, something else had changed, other than the blinking houses. Granted, the time it took for all this to happen occurred in such a smaller span of time, but 16 seconds was a huge deal, especially considering the 30-second damage function, dictating that the victimized character has a full minute before death, but only 30 seconds before taking damage. The movement in the top corner of the screen was a counter. The same counter that kicked down this very minute described something that shouldn't happen when you pause the game. Something I didn't expect, and now another person could possibly die because of my ignorant mistake, and would certainly be significantly injured at the very least. Now, there is no run function, but I really wished that there were. It had only taken me another 10 seconds or less to make it to a small cabin and switch characters, but by the time I did, there was only a few seconds left on the clock, and I knew that Laura's health meter would already be severely low. Selecting her cabin with the grimace, I loaded the next screen, and was immediately bewildered. It took me a moment to realize where I was, as I hadn't been to this place on the map, in the game, for years. The backdrop, rather than boards and paneling, albeit new or rotted with age, was instead an 8-bit rendering of rigid rocky walls and floors and noticeable drop-offs in both directions, and instead of a 3D-ish environment, as with the interiors of the cabins, the same 2D side-scrolling navigation, as with navigating the map, was in effect. Still, a few moments later, it dawned on me that I had appeared, as the Laura character with very low health, inside of the cave, near to the lake, instead of inside the cabin that I had selected. There was no more beeping, no bar in the bottom of the screen indicating Jason's remaining health, nothing to indicate that I was still under attack. Now, the cave map is confusing, to put it generalized, and staring at some unknown point in there, I had no clue as to what direction in which to head. Choosing right, I began walking until reaching the first bottomless gap and leaped over. That's when that blurry-faced Jason jumped out of the right-hand side of the screen and, before I had even had a chance to land and dodge, struck Laura straight in the face with a thrown axe, the head of which, buried about halfway into Laura's pixelated head, sprayed more than a few dots of blood and caused the sprite to deadfall right into the pit. This time, I wasn't at all surprised by the depicted blood and mutilation that shouldn't have been there, and rather immediately focused on the current status of one of my coworkers, Monica. I knew that if things followed suit, that Monica would be dead, resulting from some unexplainable violent demise, possibly indicating me as the culprit in some way that I did not yet foresee. Yeah, I turned the game off, felt that ever-looming presence return, just out of eyeshot. But I couldn't continue on anymore. Not yet. Feeling that ever so familiar, overwhelming sense of guilt. But still, the following morning when I got that phone call, I at first assumed my presumption true, and was wrong. Yeah, the detectives still thought I had something to do with the recent string of deaths and attacks, and in a very real way, they weren't wrong. But they now wanted to talk more for gathering of information in opposition to interrogation. They had found skin under Alice's, my dead girlfriend's, nails, as if she had tried fighting off her attacker. However, at first, close examination, features of pigment and other such preliminary details ruled it out as belonging to me. In fact, no one had ever mentioned Monica's name. She wouldn't be reported missing for another 2 days, and I would begin my search much earlier than that. In the park that I helped maintain, there are old cabins, a lake, and a cave I once happened upon by chance, though I never ventured inside. That was about to change. I had no proof, yet, but something about the appearance of that cave and the old, rotted walls of the cabins in the game. The first night I played, coming across a digital 8-bit rendering of my house, I had a strong hunch that these depictions were all representative of real places, just like my home. So, on a day off, during broad daylight hours, I would make my way to that old national park and seek out the inky black maw of that chasmous abyss, knowing then, even before I had found anything of substantiation, that I had finally stumbled upon the long, mysterious path that would eventually lead me to the truth of it all. The smell of old, stale air and moist earth was overpowering. The fact that I could barely see anything only seemed to compound this effect. They say that when you partially or entirely lose one sense, that the others become amplified to compensate. I was practically choking on the thick, stagnant air, wishing I had brought a bigger flashlight. The beam on the torch was powerful enough, cutting through the impenetrable darkness like a spear, but narrow and confining, begging wonder regarding the abysmal black on all sides. I hadn't really ventured in all that far, half because I kind of flaked out, and the other with the realization of how bad an idea this trek really was. If I were to slip and fall, or otherwise become trapped, No one would even know where to look for me. I didn't tell a soul where I was going. Still, I pressed on, because I knew that if I didn't, that this nightmare would never end. The powerful beam illuminated the direction I traversed, but it was the faint odor that drove me forward in a focused trajectory. The passageway narrowed as I went, forcing me eventually to get onto my hands and knees, onto the cool, damp cavern floor. I stopped all movement, freezing in place and position. I turned to investigate, even shining the light back in the direction I could have sworn I heard it. A whispering or murmuring. But now, there was nothing. And I suppose that the reverberation of my movements in here might have been the cause. Reassured of myself and my isolation, I turned back to face the maw of never-ending darkness and plodded onward. Maybe 10 or 15 more feet, I crawled before coming up to its edge. A dark hole or downward side passage, large enough to fit 3 adult humans in at once and off to the side to the right. Had I not been sporting the intense torch I carried, I may not have seen it, and possibly suffered a similar fate to the one below. For when I shakily peered my head over the edge, the smell I had been following increased 10-fold, and added to the hesitation of looking down. I shined my light down for only a second before recoiling back, hoping to avoid the image. My attempt was one of futility, for the split-second delay lingered in my mind's eye, so long, in fact, that I could discern certain details from only a quick memory. Monica's body, as I expected, lay at the bottom of this crevasse, crumpled and broken. Her skin had yet to turn a necrotic black, so she had obviously not been down there too long, and the cool temperature of the cave would certainly have prolonged her preservation. But the dampness had also begun to have an effect, because Monica's typically skinny and somewhat micro frame had started to bloat and swell, malforming the crumpled body so much that if it had not been for her fiery red hair, and my suspicion of her corpse to be there in the first place, I would have never have known it was her at such a quick first sight. I had found what I'd come for, and my suspicions proven correct in doing so, that the locations depicted in that ominous and malevolent game in fact portrayed actual real-life locations, such as my house, and this, the very national park at which I found employment, where I had discovered that cursed game in the first place. Stifling my vomit and trying to keep my panic level subsided, I slowly backed up and made my way towards the exit to the cave. Upon absconding from what was at first an entrance, the light of the 1:30 sun was all but blinding. Spending a good 20 minutes or more in total darkness had forced my eyes to become unaccustomed to sunlight, begging me to move a little slower on my 40 or so yard walk to the car. I was still rubbing the wince from my eyes when I heard a somewhat distant but also nearby noise. Something that sounded like a car door slamming shut. Cautiously, and making sure to first regain my eyesight, I altered trajectory and began moving in the direction of the noise. peering through the underbrush, purposefully keeping myself concealed, I spied the small cabin in which I had found the game, the locked shed behind it, and my boss jiggling at the handle to the shed, as if just exiting it and double-checking the door, making sure it was locked. I ducked down low into the shrubs, peeking my vision through the softly dancing leaves, practically knowing for a fact that he would simply return to his car and leave. But just as for his intents and purposes for being here, his next action left me in a sudden state of disequilibrium. He turned and made a beeline right in my direction. I did not want to be seen, especially with Monica's lifeless corpse so close by, but if I had just turned and ran away, the rustling of branches and fallen leaves would have surely given me away. Slowly and methodically, I backed my way out of my piss-poor hiding spot and moved at what I felt like was a snail's pace back to my car. The sound of approaching footsteps seemed to get ever closer, despite my continuous movement in the opposite direction, signaling that the menace making them was moving about 3 or 4 times faster than I was. For this reason, I stopped short of my car, about 20 yards away, and about 25 or so from the entrance to the cave. This meant that I could both barely see the cave entrance and the grill of my car, but I hoped at least that he could not see my four-door from where he was now entering the cave. I had no idea what the fuck he was doing here or why he felt the need to go into that cave. Had he received some kind of cryptic message, either at the design of Monica or even the game itself? I had a strong urge to not stick around and wait to find out, but the urge to stay was even stronger. Hell, I had just spelunked my way through some unknown bowel of the earth in hopes of discovering the dead body of my coworker, not the most relaxing of ventures. So, finding the fortitude to simply hide out in the bushes and wait for my boss to emerge from the maw of the cavern was an easy task by comparison. Maybe 15 minutes later, the man emerged, stepping into the light, gladly not looking in my direction, and without a look of disgust or surprise on his face. I assumed he had not discovered Monica's body because of this fact, and besides, he would have to have gone literally straight to the body and straight back, with pre-existing knowledge of its whereabouts, to make it to Monica's remains and back in such a short amount of time. There was no look of shock or disgust in his expression. In actuality, the man seemed calm, like going in and out of that cave was simply a part of some unknown daily routine. I held in my sigh of relief when the boss man made his turn to head straight back to his vehicle, before climbing in and driving away. It wasn't until I was absolutely sure that he was gone, far out of sight down the road, that I came out of hiding. The ride home was full of perplexity, still working on gaining equilibrium regarding the series of queer events. And the incoming phone call that came next only helped to make that confusion worse. It was the police station, specifically the lead detective heading up the investigation against me. He asked me a series of questions that made no sense, such as whether or not Alice could have been part of any outside activities that I didn't know about, if I knew some kid that went missing about a year prior named Kevin Hill, which I didn't, and if I had been in any forests lately, other than where I was employed, to which I told him no. I asked him the reason for this weird line of questions, to which he protested answers a few times, but he finally caved. I would like to assume that was because of my superior bargaining tactics, but in reality, I think he was fishing for any response that would indicate prior knowledge. I was informed, for one reason or another, that the 11-year-old boy who went missing, Kevin Hill, was the source of the skin found under Alice's nails, likely obtained during a struggle induced by self-defense. This kid was like 11. Alice was my age. The drive home was only 20 minutes long or so. Maybe a little more due to the midday traffic, but by the time I had pulled into the drive to my house, I had had an epiphany. The more these oddities and strange happenstances coalesced, the more my next course of action became clear. Monica's body in the cave, and my house in the game, both clear indicators that this object was manipulating reality and my life. That old, rotted cabin where I found that game, the locked shed, and that depicted mutilated mess in that video game cabin in the woods. I needed more answers. Damn the questions further investigation may provoke. Who was Kevin Hill? And why was that shed always locked? What was my boss doing in the cave? And so on. I knew there was no way to avoid it anymore. I knew where to search for answers. The answers I sought. Only I had a strong reluctance that was holding me back. That obscure, blurry, shadowy mass had been along for the ride the entire day, just within my peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight. It was foreboding enough to push me forward by itself, but at this point, my own confusion, my own disequilibrium, served as a surplus for such fuel. Hesitantly, heart racing, I purposefully placed the blank cartridge back into the NES and readied myself to turn the power on, knowing the mayhem that was bound to ensue. But I knew that any and all answers that I would be looking for could be found within that cursed Friday the 13th video game for the Nintendo Entertainment System. This time, when I booted up the game, I was on a mission. I knew exactly where I was going and exactly what I was looking for. Kind of. I knew that whatever mystery this game held wasn't in its completion. It's been right there the whole time. Another good thing, especially for any people yet left to die, Debbie, Mark, Paul, and George, represented by the names of Helga, the Goliath working at the mini-mart down the street, myself as Mark, and my good friends, Terry and Eric, respectively. Not to also mention the 14 children left in the waterside cabin, apparently representation selected at random, and I couldn't let the blood of another child be on my hands. Luckily, as I played through as Mark, the Jason thing never attacked the children on the lake, only attacking Helga and Eric once, and since the game had progressed to the start of a new day, everyone's health bar, Helga's included, was now at maximum. Still, I made certain, under the most duressful of circumstances, that neither took damage at all. I was on my game, so to speak, after jumping around for a while longer, making laps around the lake and behind the woods towards the cave. The item I was looking for popped onto the screen. A key. Yes, I already had a key, but in order to get through the next door that I assumed I would come across, I would need another one. You're likely thinking to yourself, if you know this game, wait a minute, One key opens all doors in the game, and there's no counter for how many of one item you gather, except medicine jars. Well, yes, you are correct. But the game isn't supposed to save either, or have suburban-esque settings. And I had come across a second door that was locked, even with the single key. This was simply the last thing I could think of. I assumed the core of all this resided beyond that door, and I had a good idea of what it was supposed to represent as well. I owed it to Alice, my girlfriend who died, basically by my hands, if I'm to count playing this game, or that child, butchered so brutally down the street, and his still grieving parents. At this point, I was obligated to continue, and see this through to its end. The sun was now setting in the game, and I was nearing my destination, that decrepit cabin in the woods, where I found the note, "The truth will hurt Jason the most." Well, the truth is what I was after. The wolves were out now, and I only took one hit from the two that attacked me, instantly causing a wound on my right arm in the shape of teeth marks made by a large dog, or a wolf. Of course, now privy to this game's functionalities, I essentially expected this to happen the moment I took damage in the game, undermining any doubt that was left, if there was any at all. Reaching the path I wanted and pushing up twice, I found myself at a door in the woods. Entering through it, I was greeted with the same decrepit depiction of an old cabin in 8-bit form, with a door on the opposite side of the room that shouldn't have been there. I pushed up once again, and passed through it, reaching what looked like to be the outside and another old cabin-type door. The extra key in my supposed unseen inventory, I once again pushed forward, hoping to unlock it. There was no text or preparation involved. The screen instantly flashed what looked like the still frame of a dark root cellar or a cave supported by wooden studs. A dim light sat in the corner, a small TV on a single coffee table, a tin bucket, and something that looked like purple blankets slumped in the corner. I jumped back in my seat, completely unexpecting the looming, blurred, and yet shiny face of my peripheral stalker, jumping towards the screen before the TV went black and the little red light on the NES started blinking. I didn't need to boot the game back up again. I knew all that I needed to. I'd helped him unload his truck last year of several items, including that television set. I don't know how I convinced them, Terry and Eric, but somehow got them to follow along with my suggestion. I don't honestly think either really believed me. Even now I think they disbelieve their own eyes. But friendship can foster fantastic feats, and the two agreed to meet me out at that isolated national park at which I spent my summer days, gainfully employed. When I arrived at the forested parking area, the sun was beginning to set in the sky here as well. Fortunately, I didn't see another vehicle in sight. Terry and Eric lived a good distance from the park, considerably further than I, so I assumed that I would beat them here. Feeling in my pocket to reassure myself that I had grabbed the item before I left home, I got out of the car. I stood there for a few moments, staring down the drive for any sight of an approaching vehicle, preferably Eric's or Terry's, but I was growing impatient. I had brought everything that I needed to. It was either in my hand, such as that blank NES game, or in my pocket. And not too much of a time later, my impatience got the best of me. The cabin was only a short walk away. The boss's work truck could make the rough path to it, but my little low-riding car sure as hell wouldn't. Waiting for Eric or Terry would do me no good, as their vehicles wouldn't make it either. Besides, I told them exactly where I was going. If they ran into any trouble, they could text or call me. With nothing but the increasing sounds of nighttime insects to keep me company, I began walking the overgrown path to the cabin, where I had found that game inside the wall. Now, I didn't bring a flashlight with me, which I instantly scolded myself for, as the world around me was growing increasingly darker. However, before the light faded, the view of that old cabin came into my line of sight from around the bend, peeking out from around the bushes, like a long-lost friend I no longer cared to see. I slowly approached the door and pushed it open, letting myself inside. Diminishing light or not, the details of the cabin were easily recognized, and immediately I made the correlation I thought was correct. I'd seen this place before, not just from personal experience from working here, but somewhere else. Inside that fucking game. Inside that fucking cabin in the woods. The broken boards, the debris, and other unorganized refuse. It was the same, minus the pixelated blood. This was the room the game was trying to represent. And across from where I stood was a door. A door that led out back, and I already knew what was out there. Creeping across the floor, half expecting some Jason thing to come lurching out at me any minute, I progressed towards the other door, pulling that one open as well, revealing a darkening sky and forest backdrop, an overgrown plot of grass and weeds, and an old shed. The shed my boss kept locked at all times. When I finally reached that door, and the lock, I stopped. I waited a few moments. I'm not sure for what. Maybe some sign that this was all wrong and that I didn't have to do this. But I knew better, and took a large breath, as if it were to be the last I would ever take, reached into my pocket, and pulled out the object from my drawer at home. When I had my first experience with this unlabeled copy of Friday the 13th, it brought me to an area of the game that shouldn't have been there, one that kinda looked like my street and my house. When my character jumped past my house, a key appeared, just before a strange sound outside my door and the system getting tripped off. Upon investigation, I found something odd. A key that had no business being there, on my front porch, that went to absolutely nothing that I owned. I had a feeling that this key would somehow fit this lock. I think I tried it without even thinking. Like, I knew it would work. And it did. The lock popped with ease. I removed it from the latch and opened the door. Inside was just a shed. A few old buckets, a wheelbarrow, a shovel, etc. This was definitely not what I expected to find. And that's when I felt a sharp pain in the back of my skull, and the world around me flashed white before going black. I awoke to the absolute worst scenario. And this may differ for some, being naked in front of a crowd, the exposition of one's innermost secrets, etc. But there's one common trait that all these have in common: vulnerability. I watch a lot of horror, and I frequently joke about waking up in the proverbial chair. Well, waking up to being strapped down to an upright chair is exactly and precisely what happened. When I opened my eyes, I first reasoned with this circumstance, not taking in anything else just yet about my surroundings. Panic, of course, washed over me, and once I had noticed the dire moment I was now in, I looked frantically at my surroundings. It was dark, like a root cellar or a mine shaft. There was one dim light in the nearby corner on a table with a dusty old TV on it. I instantly recognized this room. It was the room I was looking for, the room depicted to be inside the shed in the game. I finally found it, albeit it was under a better outcome. I noticed a sliver of light that grew into a sharp square, almost instantly, coinciding with a squeak. It was some sort of trap door. First boots, then jeans, then the rest of the descending form. It was a person that I could only see from behind at first, and in the dim lighting to boot. But still, I recognized him anyway, before he said a word. Mr. Zito, my boss. Now I was more sure than ever. His presence in the cave. I didn't have to worry about him finding Monica's body. He knew it was there, exactly where it was, just as I had previously surmised. He had either killed her or placed her body there. I wanted to know why and how, as I knew he would be connected to that missing boy. I asked one question, and the dumb fuck let it all spill forth like some bad Saturday cartoon villain. He told me that he didn't know how I found this place or what I was doing here, but he couldn't let me leave. Not alive, anyway, I assumed. I asked him how he knew Kevin Hill, and that's when he paused, looking shocked that I even mentioned the boy's name. Gruffly, he asked me how I knew about that, and I just laughed a little, for two reasons. For one, I knew about it because Kevin Hill is the one who basically told me, dead or not, apparently. And two, there was a pair of shadows now readying to descend into the underspace behind Mr. Zito, without his noticing, as I now held his focus firmly. Eric and Terry must have somehow found this place, saw the open trap door, and heard most of this conversation. My boss was desperately and frustratedly trying to get me to talk, to stop laughing at him. But I didn't care, because a moment later, Eric had knocked him over the back of the head with a shovel. Now, Eric and Terry may not have believed my story, but once overhearing Zito's rant and finding me bound to a chair in an ominous root cellar-like room, the two had no hesitation in attacking my captor. Now unconscious, my two friends untied me before I lent a hand in putting Mr. Zito in my place. While they attempted to wake him, I took a closer look around the small space. It was as he began to stir that I noticed it. I didn't know why, but I initially had a foreboding feeling that I needed to bring this non-labeled Nintendo game with me. There, beside the 13-inch CRT, pushed against the wall on the other side of it, was a yellowish-gray and black Nintendo Entertainment System. "What's going on?" Mr. Zito began to speak, coming out of his haze, but I paid him no mind and instantly focused my attention on the two non-believing friends. "I'm going to show you guys that I'm not crazy, and I'm going to make this fucker talk." Eric and Terry began to speak, saying that they had certainly seen enough to believe enough, but it was important to me that they believed it all, so I could at least prove to myself that I wasn't batshit insane. A small light in the corner was electric, so there had to be some kind of underground power supply energizing this place. Regarding the rest of the room that I could now see clearly, there was no purple-colored lumpy blur in the corner. I pressed my boss several times regarding everything that had happened to me since I had found this accursed game, but to no avail. That's when I threatened to insert the labelless NES cart into the system before turning it on. Both he and my two friends gave me an odd look, like they were confused as to how this was a threat. Making sure everything was hooked up, I put the card in and booted up the game. The game, despite not having a stock save system and being played on 2 different machines, brought me right back to sunset on the second day. I had the weapon I had switched to the last time I played, the same number of medicine jars, etc. Almost immediately, the alarm started blaring, only neither the remaining counselor's icon nor the one for the remaining children blinked. The noise itself was the only indication that someone was under attack. Opening up the map screen, looking for a flashing cabin, my focus rested on a dark green patch of woods, the forested cabin with the extra door. Confused questions of what the fuck and those regarding my sanity buzzed my ears, but I paid them no mind. I needed to focus and not cause any more unnecessary deaths at my own hands. But the more I played, the more I realized something. There were no zombies. No damage-inflicting crows, no wolves, no random attacks from Jason, not even a counter ticking down time. The game was now simply leading me somewhere, unobstructed, clearly helping me to uncover the truth. By the time I had reached the cabin in the woods, the in-game sky was now a nighttime one. Reaching the door in the woods and pushing up to enter, the decrepit room was displayed on the set, and now Terry began his inquiries, apparently holding off until now due to disequilibrium. But isn't there supposed to be zombies and shit? And the cabins aren't supposed to look like this, Terry claimed. My friend had played this game many times before, and now understood the discrepancies. I told you, was my only response, as I pushed forward and presented my onlookers with another door. Even Zito had gone silent, no doubt noticing the similarities between the game and the current environment. Again, the second door opened, but this time, a different depiction of the shed was presented. The image was only there for a moment, but that single moment was more than enough. The room was no longer a cellar, but a small shed with a square hole in the center. Just as I was about to comment on this very thing, the TV speakers let out a shriek before the blurred-faced, purple-esque villain jumped right at the screen, causing it to go black and the NES to again start flashing its single red light. The 3 of us, Terry, Eric, and myself, jumped back, while Mr. Zito merely jumped and trembled in place, unable to move. A few seconds after the TV went black, so too did the light, but again, so much happened in such a small amount of time. The purple mass seemed to emanate from the TV, emerging with a lunge just before the screen went blank. This time, I got a much better look at it. My first real look at it, really. His form looked male, about 6.5 feet tall. His body was dressed in an almost ironic purple jumpsuit, but his face was no hockey mask, or even a mask at all. Instead, the monstrosity seemed to be sporting a semi-clear plastic bag over his head. Even through it, I could make out his rage and expressed disdain. And luckily for us, his anger was directed solely at Zito. The thing charged at him, ripping him through the ropes that bound him as if they were Twizzlers. A fraction of a second later, Zito screamed as the monster plunged his thumbs right into his eyes. One hand then grabbed the left side of his face, and the other his right arm. And then the sound of wet tearing, crunching, and screaming, all mixed together in a single disturbing chord. And that's when the light went. More of the same sounds filled the room, only without light, and became that much more intense. What seemed like minutes passed before the sound stopped completely, first dying down into whimpers and a moan, and then a loud crash, and then silence. The three of us could have sworn we were next. Eric, in fact, had begun climbing the ladder, but the light kicked back on, and the three of us were alone. Zito's body was now lumped in the corner, mangled and bloody, laying next to a purple-clothed form about half his size, hidden behind the wall that Zito had apparently been thrown through. I needed no confirmation. I knew the smaller form to be Kevin Hill, and that this was finally over. As my friends and I wrestled to regain equilibrium, an audible sound creeped into the underspace from the surrounding forest. The police, albeit too late, had finally arrived. It's been 7 years since that day in the woods, the discovery of Kevin Hill's remains, and the utter downfall of my old employer, Mr. Zito. My friends and I were questioned by the police for a long time, for months even. Eventually, they were satisfied that we were not responsible for Zito's demise, or anyone else's for that matter. But they lingered on the notion for so long because they had no other explanation. In the end, Zito was deemed responsible for the death of Kevin Hill, the boy who was murdered down the street from my old house, Alice, Monica, and a score of other children. The circumstances surrounding Zito's death were deemed unknown, and officially remains unsolved to this day. But they know what happened. It was clear as day. Zito, who ran the management department for the local national forest, was, in reality, a child murderer. Through circumstantial evidence, the plethora of proof found that day, it became quickly apparent that he had been kidnapping and murdering children for quite some time. Ever since the day we found that boy's body, the strange occurrences, the apparition in the corner of my eye, all of it just stopped. True, I never played that unmarked NES card again, but I never felt the pressing urge to do so again either. Terry and I remained good friends, while Eric and I seemed to just drift apart. I don't think Eric really ever got over the surreal events of that day, and about 8 months after, was committed to a mental hospital for insomnia, severe depression, and acute schizophrenic tendencies. The game itself, well, I thought about destroying it, or simply tossing it away. But what if someone found it? What if someone fixed it, retaining its supernatural qualities, and then fell victim themselves? Such a prospect was too much to bear. The cartridge has been carried with me, and remains hidden in my attic to this very day. About 5 years ago, I met my wife, Carol, and about 4 years ago, I became a father to a beautiful blonde baby boy that we named Alex. Now, despite my past experiences, my love of gaming has never really dwindled. One would be right to assume that it would, but I think my lifetime of happy experiences with video games outweighed any subsequent trauma. Granted, I didn't retro game as much. which is why I ended up passing my old systems down to my young son about 4 months ago. From time to time, I'd sit in his room with him and play some Super Mario Bros. Or Marble Madness, but mostly, I'm a current-gen console guy these days. Now, it's no secret that I'm a fan of horror as well. Both my wife and my son are very much aware of my interests. My wife is kind enough to satisfy this part of me by buying me horror-related merchandise, such as t-shirts, etc., and my son, wanting to be like his father, is also into horror as well. So of course, to help strengthen our bond, my wife will feed that beast as well, promoting and supporting Alex's growing interests in the genre. Therefore, it should have been no surprise to me when I came home from work last week to the sounds of something that churned my stomach, clammed my skin, and generally made me very uneasy. I greeted my wife at the door, as I always do after work, and was caught off guard by the music that softly played, muffled by the obstructing walls from down the hall. I could only hear fragmented clips and tones, nothing in its whole, but I knew immediately what that sound was. Panicked, I pushed my wife aside, as gently as I could in haste, and ran down the hallway towards Alex's room. Turning the corner, I saw a green and blue screen, dotted with some brown spots. Below it, an 8-bit depiction of 6 main characters: George, Paul, Mark, Laura, Debbie, and Chrissy. Now, there was nothing notably off about the game. Character names were stock. The map was radiant of all its normative color palettes. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, my eyes grew wide with trepidation, and I tried calling out to my wife, but all that emerged was basically nothing more than a choked whisper. Honey? I managed. Luckily for me, she was just down the hall, doing laundry, and heard my murmured vocalization. I had no idea that she had heard me, so when she placed a hand on my shoulder from behind me and asked what was wrong, I nearly jumped out of my skin with a startle. She asked, "What?" But the look on my face must have told her I was unsettled, because she instantly recognized that something was wrong. "What's the matter?" she asked, to which I replied, "Where did you get that game?" The explanation was benign, and she told me that she had gotten it from a local used retro game store. She was completely irritated while she did. We hadn't been getting along well lately. Unsatisfied, I ran over to the NES, flipped up the door, and examined the cart inside. This irritated my son, as it glitched the game in the process. But now, being able to see the label, I was finally rest assured that the NES cartridge yielded no measurable danger. Just a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill Nintendo cart. I thought that was it. That the nightmare was truly over. And the next few days passed uneventfully. However, the circumstances of this previous weekend have delivered unexpected revelations, causing me to retread the past and find some equilibrium. Last Friday night, I returned home from work as usual, had a late night spending some quality time with my PlayStation, and it caused me to be awake after my wife had fallen asleep on the couch. At about 1 a.m., I heard the sound of an incoming text message. Knowing that I did not have my phone with me, I deduced that it must have come from my wife's. I paused my game, slid over to my wife's side on the couch, in my rolling chair, and located her phone right beside her. Usually I don't snoop, but she's been so distant lately. Curiosity got the best of me. She's so predictable. She uses the same PIN for everything, and I unlocked the device with a single try, entering the digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Someone named Mike Durant had sent her a message. I didn't recognize the name, but his douche profile pic, shirtless and flexing muscles, I instantly identified him as some jock wannabe preying on housewives. You know the type. They're all over Facebook. The message he sent, I won't repeat here for risk of sounding obscene, but it mostly entailed a discussion of my wife's, as he put it, divine genitalia, and thanked her for the quote-unquote fun the other night at the hotel. Beside myself, I indulged a little in alcohol, cried myself to sleep, and confronted her the next morning. She tried to deny it at first, but after only 15 minutes of pressure, she caved, telling absolutely all, and expressed no regret. In fact, the reason she gave is that I'm always at work, and that she had needs. So, while I'm out trying to make a living, doing my part to support our family, she's out fucking random internet cockboys, and it's my fault? Plus, she insisted that she was taking our son with her. That wasn't going to happen. She left last night, saying she was going to spend the evening in a hotel room with her new lover. So, this morning, when I decided to spend some time with him, Alex was none the wiser. He thought nothing of me sitting in his room and playing a game. Nothing malevolent ever happened to me after that day in the woods, and the incident, for all intents and purposes, was over. I didn't even know if the thing would even turn on anymore. Never mind work like it used to, but when I was presented with the option to enter custom names above each character, I knew it would. Reinforced with an 8-bit depiction of a hotel lobby, elevator, and room. Smart enough now not to enter my own name or the ones of those that I care about. Most danger was eliminated. I just had to keep the children alive. And who cares if the police do happen to catch on? They couldn't finger me last time. So they sure as hell won't now. As for Alex, he just thought we lost the game and wanted to play again. But this time, I suggested we play a different game.